I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
I've got some troubling news from the Kingdom of Aldenmore. There were not many people who understood just how deep the old Duke's loyalties ran, or how far he was willing to go to protect a crown he had served for 60 years in silence. 7 words, written in his own hand, sealed inside a vault for a decade. And now, they have shaken the palace to its foundations. What if I told you that a single letter, hidden inside the royal archive of Aldenmore, had the power to rewrite the entire line of succession, to strip a queen consort of everything she believed was hers, and hand it instead to the one woman she never saw as a rival? Duke Aldrich of Ravensworth stood beside Queen Marguerite for 62 years, silent, steady, rarely photographed without his hands folded behind his back. When he died, the nation mourned a man they thought they understood. They did not know that he had left behind a letter that was not about sentiment at all. It was a warning, a door closing, a final maneuver from a man who had spent his whole life watching palaces rot from the inside. Here is what the Crown does not want the public to know. Queen Marguerite read that letter before her husband died. She wept over it. She approved every word. And then she said nothing to anyone, not even to her own son, for the rest of her life. Somewhere inside Ravensworth Palace tonight, there are senior members of the household who wish that letter had been burned the day it was written. People who tried, quietly and desperately, to have it suppressed. People who are now afraid of what happens now that the country knows the truth. Because what Duke Aldrich wrote was never as simple as an inheritance. It was a message. Princess Eloan must be protected. The consort must be stopped. Why would a man so devoted to unity write something so final? What did he see in those last years at court that frightened him enough to reach beyond the grave? Picture an ordinary Tuesday at the National Archive of Aldenmore. Boxes of old correspondence, decades of estate papers, a routine inventory ahead of the palace's bicentennial exhibition. And then silence, the kind of silence that comes right before a storm breaks. Buried beneath folders of shipping ledgers and household accounts, an archivist found an envelope sealed with the Duke's personal wax stamp, a raven mid-flight, and a single handwritten line across the front. To be opened only after my death, in the presence of the keeper of records and one heir of my choosing. Think about that instruction. Duke Aldrich knew, with total certainty, that this letter would only be read once he was no longer alive to answer for it. He knew it would cause an earthquake, and he sealed it anyway. Very few people at court even knew the letter existed. Not the king, not his siblings, perhaps not even the queen herself, or so everyone had believed. When the wax seal finally cracked in the hands of the keeper of records, those present say the room went completely still. Legal advisors, household secretaries, the Lord Chamberlain, all of them frozen, waiting for words that would not be gentle. Duke Aldrich had never been a man of half measures, and his final letter proved it. His private fortune, built independently over decades, entirely separate from the crown's holdings, was to pass not to his own children, and not to consort Yold, but to Princess Eloan, the young wife of the heir apparent. Let that settle for a moment. He did not simply favor her. He excluded the sitting consort in writing, with witnesses present, in language that left no room for a gentler reading. One aide, speaking only on condition of anonymity, described the mood in the room as suffocating. It felt like the Duke had reached out from the grave and taken the entire court by the collar. His letter praised Eloan's discipline and her quiet, unglamorous devotion to duty, and set it deliberately against what he called ambitions that mistake attention for service. Everyone in that room understood exactly who he meant. To understand why a man so private would make such a public declaration, you have to go back to his final years, when the court of Aldenmore was quietly splitting in two. On one side stood Prince Cassian and Princess Eloan, restrained, dutiful, almost old-fashioned in their commitment to the unglamorous parts of royal life. Hospital visits, agricultural fairs, decades-long patronages nobody photographed. On the other stood the king and consort Yold, pushing hard toward modernization, media strategy, brand partnerships, a more visible, more personality-driven monarchy. Duke Aldrich was not afraid of change. He had, after all, spent much of his own life quietly reshaping the institution from behind the throne. What frightened him was something else entirely, a monarchy that no longer knew, with certainty, what it stood for. According to former household staff, who have since spoken about those years, the Duke grew increasingly concerned that consort Yold's influence was reorienting the family's priorities, away from institution and toward image, away from duty and toward personal legacy. In one remembered conversation never meant to leave the room, the Duke reportedly told a senior courtier, "The moment we allow two centers of power, the crown stops having a center at all." He also increasingly found himself drawn to Eloan, not because she sought attention, but because she so plainly did not. She endured scrutiny without spectacle. She built trust the slow way, through repetition rather than reinvention. A footman who served the Duke in his final year recalled him once remarking that Eloan was the spine of this family, whether they've noticed yet or not. Rare praise from a man who almost never gave it. His worry was not personal. It was structural. With the king newly crowned after decades as heir, the Duke feared that unresolved public unease about the consort's role could, over time, curdle into a genuine crisis of legitimacy. He had watched monarchies fall across the continent within his own lifetime. He knew exactly how these things start, not with revolution, but with a slow erosion of trust that nobody notices until it's gone. So he did what he always did. He planned, not out of spite, but as a contingency, a fail-safe for the one scenario he could not personally prevent, his own absence. When Princess Eloan was called to a private meeting at Ravensworth, she expected the usual, a briefing on an upcoming patronage, perhaps a scheduling matter. What she found instead was an envelope already opened, laid across an ancient writing desk beneath portraits of monarchs who had faced their own reckonings. As the letter was read aloud in the Duke's unmistakable, clipped phrasing, those present say Eloan did not gasp or flinch. She simply went still. This was never only about money. It was about trust, obligation, and the quiet, crushing weight of being chosen. The Duke had named her, not his own children, not the sitting consort, as steward of a private fortune built across decades of independent investment, worth, by some estimates, tens of millions in the kingdom's currency. But what shook her, according to those close to her, was not the sum. It was the realization that a man who had spent his entire public life avoiding any appearance of favoritism had just made the most decisive statement of favor imaginable, and put her name at the center of it. Alone afterward, Eloan reportedly read the letter 3 times over. To act on it meant an unavoidable collision with the consort, and possibly with the king himself. To ignore it meant betraying the one member of the family who had trusted her most. Prince Cashin's reaction, by multiple accounts, was more anguished. Caught between a father who had only just claimed the throne and a wife suddenly thrust into a fight she never asked for, he was overheard pacing the palace's east gallery late one night, murmuring. He knew exactly what this would do. Of course he knew. Duke Aldrich did nothing by accident. Needing counsel from someone who understood both the Duke's mind and the institution's instinct for survival, Eloan turned to his eldest daughter, Princess Rosalind, sharp, private, and fiercely loyal to her father's memory. The two women are said to have met alone in the palace's walled garden, with no aides present. Rosalind's advice, according to a source close to the family, was simple. Do what he asked. Just do it your own way. That guidance shaped everything that followed. Eloan made no statement, no press conference, no public defense. What she did instead was quieter and, in its own way, far louder. She stopped engaging with consort Yold entirely. No messages, not even a glance at shared events. In a household built on subtext, that silence read as a verdict. In the weeks that followed, courtiers began noticing something else. Briefings once routed through the consort's office began arriving through Eloan's instead. Invitations to certain high-profile engagements listed her name first. Nothing was announced. Nothing needed to be. Consort Yold was never going to accept being sidelined without a fight. When the letter was read into the record during a closed session of the Privy Council, her reaction, according to those present, was immediate and furious. Within hours, she summoned the king for a private conversation that reportedly escalated far beyond a disagreement. veiled threats to step back from public duties altogether unless the matter was contained before the press could seize on it. Consider the position the king was in, newly crowned, trying to project stability, suddenly forced to choose between his wife's dignity and his late father's final wish. Yole did not simply react. She organized. Friendly journalists received carefully worded background briefings, suggesting the letter reflected personal sentiment rather than binding intent. Just one of many private notes the Duke had written in his final months. But the letter had already been logged, witnessed, and archived. It carried every marker of an official document, and no amount of framing could undo that. When public efforts to downplay it stalled, Yole turned to her allies within the household's old guard, a circle of long-serving advisors devoted to protocol and precedent. At a private strategy session, she is said to have ordered a full review of every patronage and public role where Eloan held influence, with the stated goal of recalibrating the balance of power back in her own favor. Programs long associated with the Duke were quietly reassigned. An educational initiative fronted by Eloan was paused for structural review. And in the boldest move of all, Yole began laying groundwork to bring her own son into a formal palace role, framed publicly as modernization, but understood privately as a direct answer to the Duke's letter. This legacy will not pass her by without resistance. Not everyone in the palace supported the consort's counteroffensive. In a series of hushed meetings, a small group began to coalesce around Eloan and the Duke's final wishes. Insiders called them, only half-jokingly, the Four, Princess Rosalind, the Duke's steady and diplomatic granddaughter Lady Wren, the king's own private secretary, who had long been uneasy about the consort's growing reach, and the palace's chief legal counsel, a man so fluent in constitutional precedent that colleagues called him the living archive. Their goal was not rebellion. As one leaked note from that period put it starkly, "This is not rebellion. This is preservation." They were not conspirators. They saw themselves, more than anything, as the institution's immune system. The legal counsel raised the first serious question. If the Duke's private wealth was to transfer to Eloan, the structure had to be airtight, immune to future challenge. The private secretary confirmed something that startled even this small circle. In his final years, the Duke had been quietly and deliberately restructuring his personal holdings, moving them further and further from any entanglement with crown assets. This had not been an emotional decision. It had been methodical, built over years. Deep in the estate paperwork, they found something else. A rarely used clause appointing an unshakable steward of intent, language never before used in any prior directive from the family. The group read it as exactly what it appeared to be, not just a transfer of money, but a symbolic passing of some quieter, harder-to-name responsibility. The Duke, they concluded, had not simply been leaving an inheritance. He had been choosing who would carry the family's conscience forward. In a move that surprised even her closest allies, Eloan's true response came not as confrontation, but as architecture. Early one morning, the palace's communications office released a brief, almost understated statement. The founding of the Ravensworth Trust, an independent charitable body dedicated to the causes the Duke had championed throughout his life: quiet service, education, environmental stewardship. Crucially, the trust would not answer to the palace at all. It would be governed independently, accountable to the public rather than the crown. In a single stroke, Eloan had moved the Duke's legacy beyond the reach of palace politics entirely, and in doing so, placed it closer to the people he always insisted the institution existed to serve. She did not claim the fortune for herself. She appointed an independent board of trustees, chosen for reputation and independence rather than personal loyalty, and in doing so denied the consort any meaningful access, not through confrontation, but through structure. She went further still, redirecting several of the Duke's most personal patronages, his military affiliations, his environmental initiatives, a long-running youth award in his name, not to senior royals, but to the next generation, young Prince Tobias, his sister, and their cousin. It was a quiet succession of memory rather than title, built to outlast any single argument at court. Public reaction was overwhelming. Eloan's approval ratings climbed to levels unseen in a generation. Commentators began referring to her, only half-jokingly, as the conscience of the crown. The consort standing, already fragile, slipped further, cast fairly or not, as a figure of division against Eloan's growing image of continuity. Today, an uneasy calm has settled over Ravensworth Palace. Eloan continues her public duties with the same understated discipline that first earned the Duke's trust. The Ravensworth Trust operates independently, funding the causes he cared about most, untouched by palace maneuvering. Consort Yold still appears at state functions, still performs a role, but those who watch closely say the warmth between the two women never returned. The silence between them has become its own kind of statement. The king, caught between his father's legacy and his wife's ambitions, has chosen public neutrality, a decision that has cost him more in private than anyone at court will openly admit. Duke Aldrich's letter did exactly what he likely intended. It drew a line the family could not undraw. It forced a reckoning the institution would have preferred to avoid indefinitely. And it placed the weight of a fragile institution's future in the hands of a woman who never asked for the burden, and accepted it anyway. Because, as the Duke understood better than almost anyone, that is what duty has always meant.